Well, we are going to continue with Hosea tonight, and we're going to finish it up. And, last week we took a look at the first part of the book of Hosea. Did I say Hosea earlier? Okay, good. Last week we took a look at the very first part of the book of Hosea, and tonight we're going to kind of take a look at the last part. The book of Hosea really divides evenly into two different sections, and that is chapters 1 through 3 is just simply talking about the prophet Hosea and his circumstance and how that parallels between Israel and God. And then chapters 4 through, 12? 14. 14? 14, yeah. 4 through 14 is really talking about the prophecies that Hosea had. And as far as those prophecies go, as I mentioned before, it just kind of, ebbs and flows. And there's not really a whole lot of very definite structure to all of that. And so, we're going to, if we were to give it kind of a structure, what we would say is that chapters 4 through part of chapter 6 would be more talking about Israel's unfaithfulness. And then chapters 4 through 10 would really be talking about Israel's punishment. And then chapters 11 through 14 is going to be talking about God's faithful love. Because really all of these prophecies that we see from chapters 4 to 14 is really talking about more or less Israel's unfaithfulness compared to God's faithfulness. And so you have unfaithful Israel, and then you have God who is faithful with all of that. Now, kind of a quick little recap. If you remember Paul, I'm going to blame you since you got me to yawning earlier. Okay. No, I'm kidding you. Hosea is, that book that we're looking at. And if you recall, in that little timeline that we looked at, Hosea prophesied through all sorts of different kings. Only Jeroboam II was mentioned as far as the northern kingdom, but these kings were mentioned in the southern kingdom. And so, more than likely, the majority of it was here because the majority of the prophecies that we see are directed towards the northern kingdom, although there was a little bit of reference to Judah in the southern kingdom as well. Now, if you recall, what we were looking at last week with Hosea was this comparison that we've got between Hosea and Gomer in their relationship, in God and Israel and their relationship as well. And if you remember that God instructed Hosea to go and take a wife of unfaithfulness, an unfaithful wife. And it's a real question of whether or not Hosea married Gomer and then she became unfaithful, or if she was unfaithful prior to the marriage and then going on. Where God said to go and take a adulterous wife, an unfaithful wife. God, since He knows everything, and He said, go take an unfaithful wife, even if she hadn't been unfaithful yet, since God knew about it, that works, right? And so, so Hosea goes and marries her, and if you can imagine just saying, okay, well, I'm marrying you, but I know you're going to, okay. But anyway, what we see is that with all of this, you've got Hosea, Hosea, and you've got Gomer, and then you've got those children as well. And so as you've got Hosea and Gomer strays away, you've got God who's remaining faithful and dedicated, but you've got Israel that's straying away. And then you've got that children of unfaithfulness. You remember that he had 3 children. One was Jezreel, which means scatters. But then you got those other 2, and that is Lo-Ruhana, which is not loved, and then you've got Lo-Ruhana, not loved, and then you got Lo-Amin, which means not my people, okay? So those last 2 children are really kind of the focus of more bringing out what is going on in this, the rest of these prophecies too. And that is that here you've got the children of the Israelites, that is, more or less future generations, that are not going to be loved. That is, God is going to be pulling his loving protection away from them. And then at the same time, you've got the future generation of Israelites where God, because he is pulling his loving faithfulness away from them, even though he is remaining true, then they are not going to be his people any longer. But that's where we come back to God's faithfulness and how he's going to come back to them as well. Okay? All right. Now, the reason why all this played out, the reason why we've got this illustration between Hosea and Gomer, has to do with this concept of spiritual adultery. And we talked about this last week, if you remember. And you remember that, just like you've got a husband and wife that have a bond and a commitment to each other, you had Israel and God that had a bond and a commitment to each other as well. And Gomer, because she had gone and committed adultery, she broke that bond that she had with Hosea. In the same way, we've got Israel committing spiritual adultery with God. It's not physical adultery, but it's spiritual adultery in the same regard, because what they were doing is going and worshiping other gods. And in worshiping other gods, they were breaking that prior commitment and that prior covenant that they had with God. And so, do you understand the idea about spiritual adultery? Okay? All right. Now we've got another term that maybe we need to consider, and that is spiritual prostitution. Okay? So as we have read, or hopefully as you have read the last part of the book of Hosea, did you notice that word prostitution coming up? Quite a bit. And so you're thinking, okay, what in the world are we talking about with spiritual prostitution? Now, going back to Gomer, right? Gomer went and broke her vows that she had with Hosea, and then evidently she started to, and the reason why she did it is because she thought that other people were going to take care of her, which they didn't. And so then she kind of prostituted herself in order to provide for herself, and then wound up being in slavery, which Hosea came and redeemed her. You remember all that story from last week. Okay, so now we've got spiritual prostitution. Spiritual adultery is going to be just simply when the Israelites worship idols. But what's going to be the difference between spiritual prostitution and spiritual adultery? I should say spiritual adultery and spiritual prostitution. Because it all involves the same thing, doesn't it? But what's the difference? Okay, well, to ask or to answer that question, let's kind of think about, and don't mean to be too seedy. I don't mean to be getting too down into the weeds here. But why would somebody commit prostitution versus why would somebody commit adultery? Why would somebody commit adultery? For the love, for the fun of it, the attention of it. Okay. Emotional need. All right. Now, what about prostitution? Material we need, right? It is an exchange, isn't it? Okay. I will do this if you do that. Okay. Even if, even in today's side, even if somebody's being forced into prostitution, which would be a very horrible thing, it still is that way for the person who's forcing her to do it, isn't it? I mean, it is, you do this in exchange for that, okay? So, if you're talking about spiritual prostitution, what are we talking about here? It is somebody who's going to be breaking their covenant with God, and therefore they are going to be worshiping idols, but it's the reason why they are worshiping those idols, okay? And the reason why they're worshiping the idols is because they're worshiping the idol for an exchange. In other words, what we are talking about with spiritual prostitution is something that we could call seed faith. I will believe this, or I will do this, or I will act this way in order to receive something from God. Okay? And we've got that in today's society too, right? And that is that there are some people who are saying, okay, God, I'm going to do this for you if you do that for me. Or, I'm going to believe this in order for God to give me that. Okay? So it really is a quid pro quo. It's an exchange. And let me ask you something. Is that a valid reason to worship God? No, it isn't. What would be a valid reason to worship God? Love, right? And that is that He loves us, and because He first loved us, we are going to love Him in return. Okay? And so it's not anything about God, you can do for this for me, and I'll do that for you. It really is more in terms of, God has loved me, and since God has loved me and He is faithful to me, then I am going to therefore love God. So that is the way that it is today. And it really is true in Israel's case too. And that is that here you've got God, who is their covenant God. He's the one who has provided for them and taken care of them. He's the one in that covenant relationship for them. But they're thinking, okay, I'm going to go and I am going to commit adultery with other gods. I'm going to break that bonds and I'm going to start to worship all of these other idols. But then after they take that step, then it's a step of, okay, why am I worshiping these other idols? I'm worshiping these other idols for something that I can get in exchange for it. And so if I worship this idol, I'm going to get this in return. If I worship that idol, I'm going to get that in return. And really, that's a lot of what ancient idolatry was all about. We have, rain, and I don't want it to flood, and so I'm going to worship the storm god, and so it won't flood. Okay, I've got crops, and I've got flocks that I want to reproduce, and so therefore I'm going to worship a fertility goddess in order to receive that. And so it really is kind of a, I guess you could say kind of a spiritual vending machine, so to speak. Of I'm going to go over here to this vending machine, I'm going to plug in a little bit of religion over here to this one in order to get something out of it. I'm going to go over to this vending machine, I'm going to plug in a little bit over here in order to get that out of it. And once you break things down like that, and once you've got a society where it's all segregated like that, where you've got all these different idols, and you've got all these different idols providing all these different services, you can see where it's like, okay, I'm going to go do this here, I'm going to go do that here, I'm going to go do that. And all along, who really is providing for everything? It's God. And so it's like, like I said, when you look at the book of Hosea, you don't see it in terms of Hosea, do this, and so you can relate to other people. It's really Hosea, you do this so that you can relate to God, and you can relate to how God sees things and how God feels about the situation. And now you can kind of see a little bit about the situation of all of these Israelites and what they're doing, and how all that's playing out. Okay? All right. So does that make sense? Okay. All right, so like I said, when you take a look at that, chapters 4 through 14, it really is a very ebb and flow. And if you want to kind of break it down, you can take a look at different outlines. I've got a outline in my study Bible, and at the same time, I look at the way that it is in different commentaries, and a lot of them will break it down kind of in the following thing, and that is that you've got chapters 4 through the very first part of chapter 3, and this is really talking about an unfaithful nation and a faithful God, okay? And so this is pretty much kind of lining out the reason why Israel is unfaithful and pointing out some of their unfaithfulness. Now, when you read this section, you're like, well, wait a minute, it starts to go into different areas. And that's what I'm saying. It really does ebb and flow. And so this is kind of a more overview. But then in the rest of chapter 6 through chapter 10, what we've got is Israel's punishment. And so from all of this unfaithfulness that God, unfaithfulness of Israel to God, now we start to get into this section more of what God is going to do in that regard. But then what we find out is that in chapters 11 through 14 is we really have God's faithfulness brought into focus. And so we've got God's faithful love. Now again, there is more of Israel's sin in there. We've got more of what God's going to do to Israel, but it seems like the predominant focus is going to be on His love. Okay? So let's kind of take a look at some of the some key passages in each of these different sections, and let's kind of see how some of this stuff is bearing out. Sound good? Okay. So taking a look, first of all, in chapter 4, what we see is that in verse number 1, it says, "Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land." And so you can see right now, it's kind of like people are not recognizing who God is. They've forgotten that. But that's not to say that they aren't religious, because they are very religious. All right? But when you start to leave off of God and you're left with all kinds of different religions, what is really going to happen to righteousness? Righteousness is going to go down. You notice that he says this. In verse 2, he says, "There is only cursing, lying, murder, stealing, adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Because of this, the land mourns, and all who live by it will lay waste, in the birds of the field, in the beasts of the field, and the birds of the air." So when you think about, this idea about righteousness and the lack of righteousness, what God said He was going to do to the Israelites is that if you do not follow my law, which was the terms of the covenant, I am going to curse you. And so by cursing them, the flocks aren't going to produce, the crops are not going to yield its fruit. They're going to have droughts. They're going to have pestilence. They're going to have all of these different problems. And so in that, it says that all who live in it, that is the land, are going to waste away, and that includes the animals as well. And so, it's just a, kind of a drawn-in process through all of that. Now, skipping on down into verse number 5, you notice it says this, "You stumble day and night, and the prophets stumble with you." Now, when you read that and you started reading about the prophets and you started reading about the priests, did you scratch your head? Because they're not painted in very good terms here, are they? They really aren't. But who were the priests in the northern kingdom? Do you remember we talked about it last week or a couple weeks ago, is that when Jeroboam, the very first Jeroboam, when he was made king, you remember what he did? He didn't want the Israelites to go down to the temple in Jerusalem. Instead, what he did was he created his own religious system where he took false golden calves and put one at the top end of his kingdom, one at the bottom end of his kingdom. And then he took priests and ordained priests to go along with this religious system. And so this system of priesthood that's there in the northern kingdom is not something that God had ordained, and it's not something that God had set up. And it's certainly not something that God recognized and knew the truth, right? And so you had good prophets like Elijah and Elisha and Hosea that are really sent by God, but at the same time you had false prophets. And the false prophets were not sent by God. You could say that they were sent by Satan to kind of lead and deceive people. These are the ones that he's talking about here where there's negative connotations involved. And so when he says that in verse number 5, you stumble day and night and the prophets stumble with you, no wonder they're stumbling day and night, because the prophets are stumbling day and night. Jesus said, how can a blind man lead a blind man? Won't they both fall into the pit? You can't have somebody who's going to lead people into a knowledge of God if they don't have the knowledge of God to start out with, right? It doesn't make any sense. And so it says, so I will destroy your mother. All my people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. Now, that destroy your mother is really talking about the nation. It's not talking about actual mothers, I don't think. I think it's talking about the nation is being destroyed, and so then you've got the future generations that are going to have the problems with it. You remember, it's not just simply Gomer, but we've got that lo Ruhana, we've got that lo Ami. Okay, and so here are the first generation, but then the generations to come are going to be having all the problems with it. Does that make sense? Okay, but what do you think about that last little part in verse number 6? My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. By the way, have you heard that before? Have you heard that verse before? That's one of the more well-known verses in the book of Hosea. It really rings true. And that is, my people are destroyed from the lack of knowledge. That was true in Israel's case, and it's true today too. When you take a look at modern Christianity, unfortunately, the amount of Bible knowledge and the amount of Bible teaching is very, very slim. It's very, very thin up top. And because of that, you've got all kinds of different wide varieties of opinion. You've got people who are running amok, and you take a look at things, and as far as, righteousness goes, righteousness really isn't doing too good here, is it? I remember way back in the late 1980s, I read an article, and this guy was not a fortune teller. I mean, he said right at the beginning that he was not somebody who predicted the future. He was somebody who was a predictor of trends. In other words, he really worked for like insurance companies, and he would notice trends that were going on, and he would make models and forecasts of what things would be like if these trends held true. And so somebody contacted him and say, hey, why don't you take a look at the trends that are going on in religion right now, in Christianity, and just kind of do your thing with what's going on. And he said, well, he came back and said, Christianity in the future is going to be a mile wide and an inch deep. And I think he nailed that right on the head. When you take a look at Christianity today, it is a mile wide, but it is an inch deep. As far as people have a great religious experience out there, they have very, very little biblical foundational truth. And what we see here is my people are destroyed by the lack of knowledge. Same with the nation of Israel. Very similar things going on today. Okay? Now, anybody got any comment on that before we move forward? You got to stop me, because if you don't, I'm just going to keep rattling. What?
So when you're talking about knowledge here, we're talking about biblical knowledge.
Yes.
Okay.
Knowledge of God.
Okay. And when he was talking about destroying your mother, is that?
The mother is more talking about like the nation of Israel.
Okay, that's what I was thinking of. Okay.
And I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of things that I don't really understand. Like, for example, verse number 4, let no man bring a charge, let no man accuse another, for your people are like those who bring charges against a priest. I don't understand that one, so that's why I skipped it. If you're wondering, hey, you went from verse 3 to verse 5. Why is that? Well, that's the reason why. So, Carol, there's going to be things in here, that if you don't get, don't worry about it. Just, get what you can understand, get what you can know. And, the other things you can just kind of put it in a little basket and come back to it. And then maybe one day it's kind of like, oh, okay. Now, as far as nation goes, I'll be honest. I looked down in my study Bible, the notes, and it said, mother goes, excuse me. Looked down in my study Bible notes. It said nation, And I went, okay, well, that makes sense. You know.
That's what I kept thinking, and then I thought, well, I wasn't sure if that was.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay?
So you're saying that the more religious somebody is, the less biblical knowledge they have?
No, what I'm saying is that there is a disconnect. There can be a disconnect between somebody's religion and their biblical knowledge.
But you're saying that the inch deep and a mile wide is that people today have a big religious experience, a lot of religious experience, but then no knowledge.
Well, okay, I'm going to rephrase that. I'm going to say that people today have a very diverse religious perspective. I mean, you've got religious perspectives that are all across the board. Okay?
A person has diverse?
No, Christianity. You have religious perspectives that are all across the board.
Okay, but they don't have biblical knowledge.
The lack of biblical knowledge today is very astounding. The lack of biblical truth today is very astounding. I'm not saying that that's the way it is all the time. I mean, I don't think that that's the way it is here.
So you're just saying that people believe differently, and the Bible does not believe differently. The Bible's consistent. So
Yes.
Because people have different beliefs, some of them are straying from the Bible.
Yes. What I'm saying is that, what I'm saying is that because people do not have a good understanding and a belief in the Bible, then they will go and supplement that with all sorts of different religious ideas and religious philosophies.
That's kind of the opposite of what your quote is talking about from the not philosophy, or the not, what words you used?
I don't think so. I'm saying that Christianity is a mile
An
wide.
inch deep and a mile wide means that you have a very shallow religious experience, and you have very little knowledge. And it's not talking about absolute truth versus relative truth. He's not trying to identify what the true strand of Christianity is. He's saying that people who are in Christianity in their own strands are not rooted in their own strands. They're very shallow.
No. Well, okay. Maybe I'm not. I mean, I read this article, and so I'm not explaining what this article is saying. This article is saying is that people are not very rooted knowledge-wise. Okay, and so there's the inch deep, but they have all sorts of different religious philosophies and ideas, and the diverseness of it is the mile wide. And it's saying, for example, that, and he hit the nail right on the head, that, for example, in churches, you can have people with religious principles, religious thoughts that conflict with one another and contradict with one another, but they still have them and they think that they're okay. You have people today that will even have religious ideas that will be in conflict with their own religious ideas, but they will still hold them equally as value because they don't have any depth within there to think.
That's the difference. They don't have shallow beliefs because they believe wrongly. You can have deep-rooted beliefs that are wrong.
Yeah,
that's what you were saying before.
Okay.
It's that they're all shallow in their own beliefs, and that's separate from the fact that some of them are wrong and not rooted in the Bible.
Okay, that's not what I was trying to get across. What I was trying to get across is that people do not have a very deep knowledge about things, and because of that, they have a wide
kind of like Brother Neely said the other day, that when he was listening to the radio, and it was like, but he picked up that they didn't have the Bible trained. They hadn't been reading the Bible.
Right.
So they have all this religious stuff, but they don't read the Bible, so they're not
grounded. They're not anchored.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that?
I think
that's how I
it's good.
understand. But you're saying that's what I think too, because a lot of people are like, it's all about love. You know?
Right. And then you go and you distort what that meaning of love is, and then you've got all these beliefs out there. Okay. All right. moving on down to, let me see, let's take a look at verses 10 through 14 real quick. It says, they will eat but not have enough. They will engage in prostitution but not increase, because they have deserted the Lord to give themselves to prostitution, to old wine and new, which take away the understanding of my people. And so there we go with this idea, this spiritual prostitution. Okay? And so it says, they consult an idol, a wooden idol, and are answered by a stick of wood. That's kind of funny, isn't it? You know, we've got all these problems and everything. So what we're going to do is we're going to go consult this wooden idol, and this stick of wood is going to be answering us. Well, no wonder they are, you know, stumbling back and forth. It says, a spirit of prostitution leads them astray. And so there's that idea of, do this for God, He's going to do this for you. Do this for this God, He's going to do this for you. Do this for this God, He's going to do this for you. Now, continuing on down, it says, they sacrifice on the mountaintops and burn offerings on the hills, under oak, poplar, and timbereth, where the shade is pleasant. Therefore, your daughters turn to prostitution, and your daughter-in-laws to adultery. Now, this is actual prostitution, and this is actual adultery. And the reason for it is two different fold. Number one, it has to do with the lack of the knowledge of God. But number two, it has to do with what these false beliefs entailed, and then the people following it. Okay? In verse number 14, it says, I will not punish your daughters when they turn to prostitution, nor your daughters-in-law when they commit adultery, because the men themselves consort with harlots and sacrifice with shrine prostitutes. A people without understanding will come to ruin. Now, some of these idol worshiping that we had back in that time, we need to understand the real degradation that is going on there. We had, for example, if you are going to be wanting an increase in flocks, and you're going to go to the god or goddess of fertility, what do you suppose the god or goddess of fertility is going to want you to do? There would be actual prostitution that was there. Okay? If you are going to a storm god, a god of wrath and vengefulness, and you are going to be offering sacrifices, the bigger the sacrifice is, the more that it's going to get noticed by this god. What's going to be the biggest sacrifice that you can give that is not yourself in your own life? The life of your child. People literally would sacrifice children. People would really, literally engage in adultery. And so with all of this that's going on, then can't you see how the moral value and the righteousness of the people are just going into the toilet, okay? And you kind of look at our society today, and you're thinking, man, why is it that we're getting to that point? We're getting to that point because where we have come from, and that's where we're going. And that is a people without understandings coming to ruin. Okay, moving on real quick. Let's fast forward into chapter 8. Now, chapter 8 is going to be right here in this section about Israel's punishment. And so, like I said, you're going to have a lot of different things in there, but this is predominantly what it's going to be about. And so, in chapter 8, starting out in the first couple of verses, it says, "Put the trumpet to your lips. An eagle is over the house of Israel, because the people have broken my covenant and rebelled against my law. Israel cries out to me, O our God, we acknowledge you." Okay? Now, here we go to that idea about seed faith. And that is that they're thinking, okay, I'm going to go to this God, 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 I'm going to go to the Lord God, I'm going to go to this God, I'm going to go to this. So the people are saying, if Hosea is saying, you have broken your covenant, you are not being faithful to God, they're going to say, okay, well, we'll just go and we'll just sacrifice God. We're going to acknowledge you, Lord. But the acknowledgement is not all what's there. As a matter of fact, later on down, he says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Now, continuing on, he says in verse number 3, but Israel has rejected what is good. An enemy will pursue him. They set up kings without my consent. They choose princes without my approval. And so you think about that, especially that northern kingdom. You know, God did select Jeroboam, God did select Jehu, but, you know, there is so much intrigue and so much conspiracy and murder and usurping the throne and people setting themselves up to be God, you know, kings and everything like that. God didn't choose all that. It goes on down, he says, with their silver and gold, they make idols for themselves to their own destruction. Throw out your calf idol, O Samaria. You remember that calf idol, right? There's 2 idols. And he's just saying, get rid of it. My anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of purity? They are from Israel. This calf, a craftsman made it. It is not God. It will be broken to pieces. That calf is Samaria. Here you're looking at this golden statue and you're saying that's God. That's not God. People made it. And it's going to be broken into pieces when all of this comes down. Now, look at verse number 7. Tell me if you haven't heard this verse, okay? They sow the wind and they reap the whirlwind. Have you heard that? You got to hear that, right? Okay. Did you know it was in the Bible? Did you know it was from the book of Hosea? It is. And you think about the idea, you know, you're sowing wind. And so, you know, when you sow something, you are going to hopefully get an abundance of what you sow, right? So if you are sowing to the wind, that is, it's just meaningless and worthless, like this calf idol, what are you going to be reaping? The whirlwind. Okay. He says, the stalk has no bread, it will not produce no flour. Were it to yield grain, foreigners would swallow it up. Israel is swallowed up. She is now among the nations like a worthless thing. They have gone to Assyria like a wild donkey wandering along. Ephraim has sold herself to lovers. Although they have sold themselves among the nations, I will now gather them together. They will begin to waste away under the oppression of the mighty king. And so one thing that the Israelites did years later after Hosea is that to escape all their oppressors, they went and they hired the king of Assyria to come and take care of their other oppressors, the Armenians. And so, you know, but then all of a sudden the Assyrians started oppressor, and so then they went down to Egypt and they started to try to hire them. And so there's that idea about, you know, now these lovers are not necessarily just the idols, even though there's going to be idolatry in all these different nations. But it is, you know, going to these different nations to try to give the protection and the providence that only God can provide. And so here's God afflicting the land, afflicting the crops, afflicting, you know, because mainly things were agriculturally based as far as their economics go. And so here there are problems with that, but then they're give themselves to all these different nations, and it's just not working out too well for them. Okay? All right, quickly, let's take a look at this last little bit here, and that is chapters 11 through 14, which is really talking about God's love. And so if we skip on over to chapter 11 in verse number 4, it says, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. By the way, does that little bit there in chapter 11 verse number 1, out of Egypt I called my son, does that ring any bells in the New Testament? That's in the book of Matthew. Okay? And in the book of Matthew, Matthew quoted that to refer to Jesus. And so if you recall, here is Jesus in Bethlehem with Mary and Joseph. When Herod went to kill the babies, where did they take Jesus? Egypt. Okay? And so Jesus spent his very young years there in Egypt until Herod and the ones that were seeking to take his life, when they died. And then God told them to come back. And so Matthew quotes this in Hosea to say, out of Egypt I call my son. Now, what is Hosea talking about primarily? He's talking about the Old Testament nation of Egypt, right? Where Egypt went down, or excuse me, Israel went down into Egypt to find protection and to food there because Joseph had promised them, right? And so the young nation of Israel went down there to be there, but then later God called them out to be that people. And so there's a little bit of a parallel there, okay? Continuing into verse number 2, it says, but the more I called Israel, the further they went from me. They sacrificed to the Baals, and they burned incense to images. It was I who taught Ephraim. You remember Ephraim's that other name for Israel. Taught Ephraim to walk by taking them by the arms, but they did not realize it was I who healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with ties of love. I lifted the yoke from their neck and bent down to feed them. Now we continue, we skip on down to verse number 8. It says, how can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I treat you like Admah? How can I make you like Zeboim? Now, those are the kind of things that we read that we're like, what is Admah? What is Zeboim? And, Admah and Zeboim, that was some of the cities of the plain that fell when Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah were not the only cities that were destroyed back in the book of Genesis. There were several other little cities around them. Admah and Zeboim were two of those. And so he's saying, how can I treat you like these cities? How can my judgment be so bad that it's going to completely wipe you out, Israel? Because he's saying, how can I give you up? He says in the middle of verse number 8, my heart is changed within me, and all my compassion is aroused. I will not carry out my fierce anger, nor will I turn and devastate Ephraim. For I am God and not man, the Holy One among you. I will not come in wrath. They will follow the Lord. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, his children will come trembling from the west. They will come trembling like birds from Egypt, like doves from Assyria. And I will settle them in their homes, declares the Lord. And so here we've got the picture of Hosea and Gomer, right? So Gomer has prostituted herself, but God said, go and redeem her. And so he went and he redeemed her, okay, and her children. And so what we have here is the same way. God, because of his faithfulness to Israel, is going to come and bring her back into the land. Now this is something that's going to happen in our future, okay? All right. You got any questions and comments about that?